It's punk rock bowling time. That's right, for the 24th year, one of the greatest festivals on earth, in my opinion, returns to downtown Las Vegas the weekend of May 25th, 26th, and 27th. I have had some of my greatest times playing this thing and just hanging out at this thing. You want to know how much this festival speaks to Turn Out a Punk's mindset? The headliners are Devo, Descendants, and Madness. Every day of this festival, the lineup is stacked with amazing bands of all types and stripes of punk and hardcore from all different eras, from ska to post-hardcore. We're talking like Bratmobile to Rock from the Crypt to Stiff Little Fingers to the Cosmic Psychos to Scowl to Chad. And then there's also all these late night after shows which are happening. And you wouldn't believe the lineup of these things, from the Zeros to Agnostic Front and everything in between. This festival is out of control for fans of punk. So I hope I will see you there, because this isn't like some sort of festival that you just go to and the bands are secluded in some sort of backstage area. Bands and fans and just punks alike are all just taking over downtown Las Vegas. So you turn around and all of a sudden you're gambling beside John Doe from X. I don't know if John Doe gambles, but if you turn around on the buffet line, you'll probably see me. And you better believe we're going to be talking about punk music. And because this festival loves this podcast as much as this podcast loves this festival, Punk Rock Bowling is bringing you a series of special episodes. So each and every week, I will have an episode going up featuring someone that's playing this festival. And hot damn, are there some good ones coming. Head over to punkrockbowling.com and hopefully I see you in downtown Las Vegas, May 25th, 26th, and 27th. Hello and welcome to a very special Turned Out a Punk Rock Bowling episode. You heard the ad off the top, all going down in Las Vegas. And today on the show, oh boy, I've been excited for you to hear this one and waiting to release it. Well, now it's apropos because the reunion starts now. On the show today, Lil Joe Raposo and Chris Rest from the band RKL, Rich Kids on LSD. Oh boy, this is a good one. Lots of great stuff. If you've been a fan of this podcast for a while, you know that RKL is one of those bands that's kind of legendary over the course of this show. So to be able to sit down with not one but two members of this band and hear their journeys, oh, you're in for a treat. First, head over to the email address turnoutapunkpodcast@gmail.com to get in touch with me. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram @LeftForDamian. Turned Out a Punk has all sorts of social media stuff. You can find it on those platforms. I play in a band too. We're called Fucked Up. Find out more information at fuckedup.cc. We got some new records out and lots of other stuff. More announcements coming soon. But this is all about RKL. Huge thank you to Vanessa and Christina at Mutiny PR. And of course, my little brother, Tristan Abraham, for setting this whole thing up for me. Because, oh boy, as I said off the top, this is one of those ones. Chris Rest and Joe have gone on to do lots of other stuff, Lagwagon and Bad Astronaut, sort of tons of bands they played in, very, very accomplished musicians. And now they're getting back together with the band that started it all off for, actually both of them, RKL, Rich Kids and LSD. And sadly, as Jason and Bomber are no longer with us on vocals, they got our boy Tony from Municipal Waste. And oh my gosh, am I excited to see this. This will be going down May 25th in Las Vegas at Punk Rock Bowling. But starting on May 1st, they've got a bunch of shows. The only one that actually looks like it has any tickets left for it is the final May 5th show in Los Angeles. And I don't think there's very many left of those. So grab tickets and go to those shows. And check out any and all music by RKL. A fascinating band, an amazing band, lots of different eras and evolving stuff. A hugely influential band, as we go on a lot about in a second. So you hear us talk about that. And I guess I'll see you in Vegas. I will be down in Las Vegas for RKL, and I will be there for all those headliners. It's going to be a show. It's going to be a fun time. But until then, sit back, relax, and enjoy Lil Joe and Chris from RKL on Turned Out a Punk. Chris, Joe, Chris, thank you both for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us, Damian.
Thank you.
Well, at the risk of repeating myself immediately after I said this, you guys are the most storied band when it comes to this podcast, and it comes up time and time again. And I think prior to this, I was always a fan of RKL because I got the records up here, just part of like the punk rock lexicon. But through doing this podcast, I've really come to appreciate not just the influence, but kind of the impact RKL had on punk and just how much it shifted everything.
At the time, we didn't seem to be making any impact. Maybe after we broke up.
The best ones never do during their time. It takes a while to set in the impact.
Yeah, the impact was basically taking a toll on our constitution and our willpower.
You can see the impact on our faces.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, like I guess that's the other part of this band. I think Chris Flippin even says that RKL is a cursed band, and that there's this sort of like, and not to make light of it, but there is sort of this darkness that kind of is running throughout the history of the band up to a certain point.
I think that might be true with any 80s punk band. I mean, it was kind of a rough time. I mean, look at the circumstances with Joe. I think he joined the band, and within months we were going to Europe, and we landed in Amsterdam, I think, and we spent like a week there. He had never left the Bay Area, as far as I know.
Yeah, Joe, you were a minor, right? You had to be signed over.
Yeah, that is correct. My parents weren't going to let me go at all. And so it took a lot of explaining. It took a lot of people in my corner. One of the biggest people that had influenced my parents into letting me go was my high school principal at the time. And he, Doc was cool. I went to a continuation high school, so it was different. There were a lot of, baby mamas at the school with their kids. I mean, there was a daycare at the school. So it was a school for troubled youth, but our principal, Doc, was super cool. And when I told him I had an opportunity to tour Europe at such a young age, he was like, "You need to do this. You need to go, because you're gonna learn more during this whole experience than you ever are in high school here or whatever. And you can always come back and finish your year." I was on the 5-year plan after that tour. So he said, "You can come back and you can finish high school here, and we totally support you." And I was like, "Well, my parents aren't going to let me go. So will you call them and talk to them?" And so he did. And he convinced them to let me go.
Wow, I didn't know that part of the story.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of awesome that you have an educator like that who could see that in you. Like, obviously this was your destiny to do this sort of thing, and to see it that early and be like, "No, this kid has to do it." And I'm a parent now, and I would hope that I'd have the courage to let my kid run off, maybe not with RKL, but run off with a band to Europe.
What's the band's name again?
Yeah.
I think the reason why my parents were okay with it too is because they're old school Portuguese, right? They had no idea really what drugs were about. So they didn't know what LSD was. And I don't think that my brother or sister had the heart to tell them what it was. So as far as they were concerned, they just knew the name of the band was RKL. They didn't ask, what that meant. And
it's hard to find other meanings for that acronym. I remember the cops asked me what it meant one time, and I was like, Red Clan of Lizards. They thought we were like a communist reptile band or something.
I think it's definitely, well, we're going to get into all this stuff, but I got to kind of start this off the way they all start off, which is asking you guys how you got into punk. But I guess we'll kind of work chronologically. And so I'll start with you, Chris. How did you get into punk? Do you remember the first time you ever came across it?
Okay, so I thought the B-52s were punk when I first heard them and Devo. And so I thought I was punk because I loved both of those bands. But I was also super into FM rock radio. I played drums and guitar. So I was, I'd put on Led Zeppelin and rock out to that. And I was super into the Cars and Cheap Trick and Boston and like just anything that I heard on FM radio because I didn't have any older siblings that would, turn me on to what was cool. So I didn't know Kiss, and like a lot of the kids in my generation were into Kiss back then, and for some reason that never crossed my path. And but the first punk record that I ever heard and held in my hands was the Clash London Calling album, and that's because one of the people that was renting a room for my parents had a record collection at the house, and I was just going through his records, and he had that London Calling album, and I saw that cover and I was like, oh, I got to hear this. And I was totally into that record. I had no idea that was punk rock at all. And then I saw something on, I don't know, it might have been PBS, and they showed this punk rock show in London, I believe. And there was people with safety pins in their face and they were eating red Jello off a baby doll. And I was like, totally turned off. I was like, this is not something for me. This is disgusting. And then, so we lived in Santa Barbara at the time, and I saw that Black Flag was playing in Santa Barbara, and I knew that they were a punk rock band, but that's all I knew about them. And I was too young to go to that show. Some of my friends that I later in, junior high school discovered real punk rock, had gone to a few shows in LA before I had ever even been to a show. I was like I think too scared to go down to LA, and I don't know. My parents would have let me. They would let me do anything I wanted, really. But yeah, that London Calling record, I listened to it a lot, and I had no idea that was a punk rock record. That would go on, and then I would put on ELO or Cheap Trick, and I was just my rotation of like 6 records that I listened to all the time and played drums to and stuff.
Well, I definitely think B-52s are a punk band, and
yeah.
Fred was on the show, so.
Oh, really? Awesome.
So does Fred actually talk like he sings? I've never seen him, like, did he just go, Damian, hi, hello, it's awesome to be on your podcast.
I wish I got him that excited that he actually had to break into that voice, but no, he kind of like, it's like Geddy Lee, you can tell that voice is there, but he tones it down when he's just waxing nostalgic about seeing the Sex Pistols or something.
Wow.
But I think that's a great thing about punk in that first period is that it doesn't really have a sonic identity where like Devo fits in, B-52s fit in, obviously the Clash fits in, and there's sort of this openness to the whole thing. And I obviously that changes as it progresses, but that first wave is awesome because it's just, what the hell is this?
Yeah, I mean, the whole scene around CBGB was so cool with Blondie and the Pretenders and Talking Heads and all those cool bands that were kind of new wave, and some of them were punk, and like the major labels grabbed hold of Blondie and made them a disco band. I mean, that was kind of a bummer, but I still love those records, even though I knew they weren't originally a disco band.
How about you, Joe? Do you remember the first time you kind of came across it?
Yeah. So, chronologically, I had actually thought that the Surf Punks were a surf band, or sorry,
Me
punk
too.
band. Like I thought because they had punk in their name, I really thought that was punk, and so I want to say, and they were, they were actually a punk band because they were snotty, and their lyrics were funny, and
And
sound
lewd.
was very punk rock too, if you think about it. Um, but yeah, so I thought the Surf Punks was punk, and that was like my introduction into it. But just because I was hanging out with other skateboarders, and so like we just thought it was hilarious. But I think my in eighth grade, uh, I met this like kid, and he must have been like probably about 11 years old, and he used to skateboard out in front of his mom's house, and we used to pass by him every day, and he looked like a punker, but he would be skateboarding, and we were like, what's going on with this kid? And so we kind of gravitated to him a little bit, and he was like listening to like real punk, and it was a trip because he's like, well, what kind of music do you listen to? Blah blah blah, and I think at that point I just said the Surf Punks, and he was like, "That's not fucking punk." And here's like 11-year-old kid telling this like 14-year-old kid, like what punk is. And I'm like, "Well, what is punk?" And he would make mixtapes for us. And I believe the first
That's
mixtape
awesome.
that he made was it was the Adolescents' first album on one side, and then Anarchy in the UK by the Sex Pistols on the other side. So when I went home and listened to those songs or those albums and the songs, I was like, holy fuck, man, this shit is cool. I mean, two great albums though, right?
Mhm. Oh,
Yeah.
Two
definitely.
awesome albums. Like what great albums to get someone into the whole genre than those two. Um, and I just thought it was the best thing ever. So I would go back and I'd be like, what else you got? What else you got? And up until that point, my brother introduced me to rock at an early age because he was about 3 years older than me at the time. So he would come in with Deep Purple and Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin and AC/DC. I remember we almost had like every AC/DC album at home, and he would play it all the time. So that was my introduction into hard music and heavy music and stuff. But yeah, it was that kid. Tyler was his name. I forget his last name, but he introduced me into punk rock, and so I'd go back and ask for more mixtapes, and so he would introduce me to Black Flag at DI, and then he would give me like pointers on compilations, and then once I got into skateboarding a little bit more and going to spots, then you met other skate punks, and then they would introduce more music to you, and then like right around that time, I think it was probably about what 83 or 84, everything was just popping off at that point. And that's also how I got introduced to RKL too, was I believe my freshman year of high school. Buddy had bought the Mystic compilation, and then we were listening to that. And then I believe like my first compilation was rap music for rap people. Do you guys remember that?
Yes,
That's a great record.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think
I had that
Tales of
Surf Punks
Terror was
record
on there,
too.
right? Tales of Terror, Flipper was on there, right?
The red one, that red record with the black, and there's like rats all over it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There's volume 1 and
That's a
volume
great
2, and I
record.
always confuse.
Volume 1.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who was Angry Simone's are on that too, maybe.
I believe so.
Okay. Yeah, no, fantastic compilation. I'm also
I still have it.
I love where AC/DC kind of sits in punk. Like in America and Canada, it's different, right? They're like a rock band, but like you look at those early kind of Australian years for that band. There's like even a flyer that I saw last time I was there for a show they were playing in like '76, and it's all kind of, it must be '77 because it's all like Sex Pistoled out pink and kind of like neon green, and it says punk rock at the top. And like when they came,
Really?
yeah, when they came over, they played CBGBs apparently one time and blew everyone away. And then when they played LA on the first tour, the Dogs opened up for them, that Detroit punk band. So they do kind of have like a place in punk, and when you hear it, it does kind of like in the same way that Radio Birdman has that kind of realness to it, like AC/DC definitely has that flowing through.
Well, they've always stayed so raw. I mean, they never like went for that overproduced like sound. And Angus to this day, I believe, doesn't use any pedals. He just goes straight into a Marshall and just cranks it up, and that's punk rock right there. I mean, it's rock. It's rock and roll. It's like straight up raw rock and roll. And Angus is probably my favorite guitar player of all time because I think he's kind of underrated. Like, I mean, once you start trying to imitate or to play his solos and stuff, his vibrato is insane, and his abilities, and he doesn't ever stop moving. He's like Joe, he's like, he's nuts.
Yeah, even into his old age, and I'm starting to feel it. That in my 50s, I'm like, fuck, am I going to be able to jump anymore soon? He goes off, even to this day. He goes off.
We all need that.
Impressive.
We all need that late era Poison Idea stage setup where Pig Champion had the chair that he could sit down on stage.
Oh man!
At a point, it is like also interesting with the Adolescence record and Nevermind the Bollocks. Like, you have two records that sound so timeless, but also are like really interestingly produced in terms of like the guitars, especially on Nevermind the Bollocks, and the vocal arrangements on the Adolescence records. Like,
I love both of those records.
Yeah, and they both sound really fresh. Like, you can put on both of them now and it doesn't really sound dated in the way that even records that came out way later sound dated now. Like, stuff from the 90s can sound really dated compared to those things.
Yeah. I mean, they're just really great, like, produced albums, at the time. Just they figured out a way to, like, if you could ever polish punk at that point, it was just, I think it was just getting a good rock sound, like a lot of really great early 80s albums. They just went to the right studio and they got the right producer and engineer to just polish up what they had, but make it still sound really raw,
Mm-hmm.
Another band that I was like super into before I discovered punk rock was the Knack. And I remember when the Knack all of a sudden had a hit, that My Sharona, and all these people were furious because they were kind of considered a punk band, I think, before that. And I actually went to go see the Knack, and the first real punk rocker I ever saw in my life was at that show. So I went to go see the Knack. I was like 13 years old, and this punk rocker with spiked hair was wearing a leather jacket, and huge block letters on the back of his leather jacket said "Fuck the Knack," and so, because he must have probably liked them, and then they came out with this hit record, and then he was like "Fuck them," and it turned out that he was the singer in I think Santa Barbara's first punk rock band called the Strap-On Dicks, and his name was Chris Syphilis, as far as I remember.
Chris Syphilis. Nice.
Yeah. The Strap-On Dicks were from Carpinteria, which is like a sleepy little churchy surf town. I call it like Mayberry on surfboards.
Did they ever put out records, or are they in it?
No, I heard they were terrible. I never heard any songs from them, and I never got to see them. I think they played like the high school quad at Carpinteria High School. But I mean, they must have gotten a lot of, I mean, even when I started high school, I got all kinds of shit just for having short hair and like kind of thinking I was punk. And I didn't even look that punk, but like these guys were in, 1980, and that was a big deal in a little town like Carpinteria.
Yeah, that's wild.
You gotta love that. You gotta love that name, the Strap-On Dicks.
Yeah.
Awesome.
They would just call themselves the Strap-Ons when it was inappropriate to say the whole name.
The Knack too are kind of the like you're saying, almost part of the punk thing, and almost like the inheritors of where that Blondie power pop stuff goes. And I guess Blondie doing a Nerves cover, like there is that side of punk that is that really the last and sort of a deep, heavy, sort of leaning on melody right off the top with those types of bands.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much. I love that era of almost new wave, almost punk, bands. There's so many cool ones that I haven't even heard probably. But.
Yeah, I think that's when like that like mid stage where these bands probably were punk at some time or another. But definitely fans of punk, as you can tell by their sound too. But it started evolving, right? So new wave was like when it started getting like crafty, like a little technical. And I mean, look at Devo and what they did with the weird timings and everything else like that, you know. And definitely I agree with you. It's such a cool time for punk and music when these bands are like evolving. You know, it basically kind of paved the way for other bands to, you know, say, hey man, it's okay to explore and kind of put some musicianship behind, you know, our music. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's almost like when hardcore comes in, there's this sort of rule book that comes in when bands could only do a certain sound. And I love hardcore, so I'm not dissing it in any way, but like that's when it becomes a defined thing. And it's not necessarily artier bands anymore. It's bands that do this specific sound. And that eventually implodes, I guess, at a certain point. Like you hear talking to people from LA that at a certain point post 85, everything just kind of like dries up. Shows got too violent, bands moved, like yourselves or No Effects, like bands were kind of fleeing, it seems, because things were getting too hairy, and it kind of killed the scene.
Yeah, LA shows were brutal.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Well, when they actually, you know, made task forces in LA to like police task forces in LA to combat the punk scene and the music scene, you know, that I mean that's insane. You know what I'm saying? It's like, come on, man. It's bullshit. And that creates violence. It created more violence than it helped.
Yeah, there's one punk show that Bomber went to with a lot of our friends, and they asked me if I wanted to go, and I said no. And it turned out the cops threw tear gas into the building, and then were just waiting outside with riot gear and just beating everyone who came running out of the building.
Yeah, and like Joe said, that has an effect, right? Like that, like Nicole Panter was on. I always quote her for this, but she said, talking about the LA hardcore scene, that like a lot of times punk is people with trauma inflicting trauma on other people who will in turn inflict that trauma themselves. And you can definitely see that with the cop violence and then the way LA punk went, where it got more hard and more violent. Like there is going to be a reaction to these forces that are kind of imposing themselves on you.
For sure.
Yeah. Like I said, it didn't help. You know, it just made fucked up people even more pissed off. And, you know, when someone's already going to explode and all they want to do is go to a punk show and get into the pit and do stage dives to release some nervous energy or release some tension that's going on at home or probably hate their parents, and here comes cops. It's like, I don't think they knew what was like in for them, you know?
Well, there was punk rock gangs too. They had the LA Death Squad and Circle One and
Yep.
Suicidal, and it was not a safe thing to do to go to a punk show back then in LA.
Well, and then it's like when you watch America's Hardcore, there's that Rollins quote that he has about when they went on that, or I guess it's not a quote, it's like a whole little section where he talks about when the Teen Idols went from DC out, took the bus, the Greyhound out to California and got to see the Circle Jerks play, and just seeing the level of, I guess, organization in the approach of some of the punk kids and the sort of the early sort of gang incursion into punk rock, and taking that and bringing that back to the East Coast, and then just how they went around and kind of, I guess, gifted it to other scenes, you know, the Boston kids, and then famously the New York kids were all getting beaten up by those kids, and so the New York kids got harder, and you really do see sort of this exporting of LA style hardcore that happens all over America and then ultimately all over the world.
Thanks, LA.
The sword swings both ways.
Well, I guess we could thank the cops, right?
Yeah.
For helping move that along.
Yeah. If the cops hadn't gotten involved, it would still all be bands sounding like the Screamers and the Nerves, you know. Well, Joe, you brought it up earlier, and I gotta ask about this. Speaking of great producers, Doug Moody and Mystic Records, like Mystic, because of their distribution, those comps got all over the place, and sadly, I don't think many of the bands saw the returns on these comps getting all over the place. And I don't mean to laugh at that, but it is something that has come up several times on the show.
Well, that was before I joined the band, but I heard stories once I joined. Chris can elaborate on that for sure.
Definitely. I mean, so when we first recorded at Mystic, there was this club right around the corner from Mystic Records, the Cathay de Grand. It was like a Chinese restaurant, I think. I don't know. But they would just go and see these new punk bands, and then they would say, "Oh, how would you like to record a record?" And we're like, "Of course." And so we were like starstruck. We just signed the contracts right then and there. I from what I've learned, I don't have a copy of the contract. The contract clearly states that bands will be paid in Mystic merchandise. So that's why none of the bands ever got any money, because they signed the contract that said they would be paid in Mystic merchandise. So they probably owe me like 1,000 Mystic t-shirts.
Well, one of my most treasured records in my collection is a copy of Keep Laughing that was done, but it was a limited edition signed by Doug Moody version that they did.
Wait, why did he sign it so small?
I don't know. And why is there a gold star like a teacher would put on your test if you got a good mark?
You did good.
A lot of this thing begs a lot of questions from me, and I had to pick it up when it came out, because
you know what that star means? It means it made him a lot of money.
Once again, not to laugh.
Paid a lot of money and bought him a house or a new car or something. He put a gold star on.
There's a legend too that board was used to record. Oh, now I'm going to fuck it up. Like one of the Led Zeppelin records, I think.
I believe there was some story like that. I remember some kind of story like that, but who knows?
I don't remember any Led Zeppelin album having that much reverb.
Well, the reverb was real reverb. They had a speaker in the basement of this giant, well, I don't know, giant building, but it was a LA building. They had speaker on one side and a microphone on the other, and that was their reverb. So it was real reverb. They actually sent the signal of the snare drum down to this speaker, and it would play through the speaker, and then they'd capture it through the mic and go back into the board, and that was how they got their signature Mystic reverb sound.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, nor did I.
I thought it was like they would just plug a signal into, like one of those old Fender reverb tanks, the spring reverb.
Yeah, they got like 10 slinkies and taped them together.
Yeah, that's basically what it is, and it's funny because it's just like a tube-powered slinky. That's what it is, and it looks like an amp, but you look inside of it, it just has all these springs.
Yeah,
in a tube, a single tube or something.
This was a real reverb like they did back in the day. Doug talks about when he first started working in recording studios. He has all kinds of crazy stories about the methods they used to do stuff. Like, I mean, he's a pretty old dude. He was in the very first recording studios in England that before multi-tracking, and they had all kinds of crazy ways to do stuff back then. And I've listened to a few of his interviews, and like the guy, I mean, I got to give him credit. He signed RKL when nobody else would have signed us. We were pretty horrible when we were, 15 years old. Who isn't? There's not that many great bands when they're that age, but without Mystic Records, who knows? We may never have gone on tour or done what we did.
It is a label that had unbelievable reach with these records that kind of showed up all over the place. And I guess once again, not to the benefit of the bands, but these things were kind of kept in print. So by the time that I was getting into punk years later, you could still maybe not find originals, but find that Super 7 series that they did
Yeah.
of the reissues of that 7-inch later on. And
On Xerox paper cover.
yeah, and I find it fat. Well, I'm just recently came to this sort of realization that I was growing up much more versed in California punk because of Frontier and Mystic keeping these records in print than I was with the stuff from Toronto and Canada. Like DOA records weren't in print back then. You couldn't find those things, or the Subhuman stuff back then, but you could always find Ill Repute stuff, or Aggression or RKL. Like those Mystic records did kind of serve to get the band's name out there. Once again, not to pay them, but name got out. Paid in publicity.
Well, I'm sure anytime we wanted, we could have gone down and got a few Mystic t-shirts.
I guess it's associated so much with that era of hardcore, but that first Mentors records on there, or that Vox Pop record, or that pre-Minutemen Hate Taxi band that the drummer from the Minutemen had. Like there is.
Oh yeah, Hate Taxi. That's right.
He was in a punk, right, kind of out of the gate, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, Doug, he was just into young people creating music, and I mean, he had a good heart. I mean, his heart was in the right place. It's just, at the time our band over the years did a lot of F music, F Mystic records, don't buy Mystic stuff, because they never did send us any kind of statements or paychecks. But I still to this day give them credit for doing what they did for us. I mean, like you said, I mean, I had no idea that they had better reach than any other tiny independent label at the time, but that's cool to hear that.
And I guess that's also the sad reality of punk labels. Not all of them, but a lot of them back then, where Posh Boy, you hear stories about, CD Characters, there's stories about that label as well. Like it feels like you almost had to sign a Faustian deal to get your music out there, where you might be dealing with a label that's very sketchy and you might not get paid from it, but who else is going to put out your record unless you had money to do it yourself?
Yeah.
Which not a lot of people did.
I gotta say that, before I joined RKL, I listened to all the Mystic stuff, like everything, Ill Repute, like the samplers, like Oxnard, that whole scene. I mean, those records were all up in Northern California, like you walk into any kind of independent music record shop or store or whatever, and they had like a Mystic section.
Yeah. Yeah. And that sound, as much as people like deride it, like that has become a sound that people try and get now for their bands. Like the Mystic sound is like the Motown sound of.
You need a basement with a speaker in it.
You need that board from the Led Zeppelin record. You need a reverb room in the basement. There's a lot of stuff that went into it, but that has become like a defining part of this culture.
That's funny.
It, like you mentioned, Joe, like Northern California, it feels like really starts popping off. Like there's hardcore and punk right from the get-go, but that mid-late 80s scene, like looking at that Alchemy Records roster, like talk about one of the great rosters of all time, with the Melvins, Neurosis, Poison Idea, Sacrilege, Clown Alley, Yourselves, Paranoia. Like it was a hot time for punk in that area.
Yeah, well, I think Alchemy, like all those bands, like what is it that like Portland? Isn't that in Oregon? Oh, well, it is Northern California too, but it's like
well, Poison Idea hadn't relocated, but the Melvins had moved down by that point and were living there. Okay. But you're right, like Poison Idea, I guess, wasn't geographically situated there, but they were kind of, I think, going down there at that point a little bit. And but yeah, it is more like I guess pan West Coast thing,
like a Pacific Northwest, right?
Yeah, Northern California being part of it.
Yeah, and I guess you could include Northern California with that, since California is so big.
Yeah.
Like geographically, like you said. but yeah, I mean, like in Northern California, like it was, I mean, the shit that was going on in Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, it was a major scene. I mean, like metal was starting to happen at that point too, and I remember like bands like Metallica would play like the Rock on Broadway, like the Stone, and then right across the street there was Mabuhay Gardens, and then you could go there and see Crucifix, like in fact that was and it was all ages too because it was technically a Filipino restaurant.
Mhm.
So that's where I went to my first show was at the Mabuhay Gardens. It was Tales of Terror at the Mabuhay Gardens, and I believe I was 14 at that time. Yeah, and I got hit over the head with the player's bass because I was in front. And I joke to this day, I think that's the reason why I play bass.
You had it beaten into you.
It got beaten into me at an early age, exactly.
When did you start playing?
Well, my brother was a guitar player, and he bought his first electric guitar, I think, when I was around 8 years old. So he had a paper route, and he was probably around 11 or 12 at that point. And so he bought an electric guitar and an amp, and then he started learning how to play. And I always wanted to be like my brother. You know, I looked up to him, and I always wanted to do what he wanted to do. If he skateboarded, I wanted to skateboard. If he did BMX, I wanted to BMX. If he played guitar, I wanted to play guitar. So basically, when he wasn't home, I would pick up his guitar and tinker around with it and learn how to play it and stuff like that. And I wasn't very good at all. And then he got mad, and on my 8th birthday, he convinced my parents to buy me a guitar, an acoustic guitar, and I think they got it at Montgomery Ward's. for, for all those people that can remember Monkey Ward's, yeah.
Monkey.
And yeah, so I started tinkering around with the guitar at like 8. So that's when I first started playing, and I think later on that year, my brother started giving me like lessons, and then we played the elementary school, the Sunny Brace School talent show. We wrote an original song. We played the talent show. So that was my first show at 8 years old. But that's how I started getting into music, and then I started getting into skateboarding. But it's still like jamming around and still playing guitar. And it wasn't until my freshman year in high school when me and a bunch of other people who listened to punk and metal and a bunch of my skate friends, this guy Joe Markey, he was like the full like crazy metalhead dude. And he had a garage at his mom's house where he had all this equipment set up, and he asked everybody if does anybody know how to play an instrument, and do you guys want to come over and jam because we want to start a band, like a punk band. And so we went over there, and everybody wanted to play guitar, and so I wanted to play guitar too, and no one wanted to touch the bass. So I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. And then I started playing bass, and I was like, oh my God, I fucking love this thing. It's great. So I played the bass like a guitar. That was the first time that I picked up a bass. And then ever since then, that's been my main instrument.
So prior to getting into RKL, like, had you played in any bands that had like done any sort of not touring, I guess, but even like serious gigging beyond this first band?
No serious gigging at all. RKL was the first band that I had ever been in that I played like real gigs. My gigging up until that point was basically playing like finals weeks at high schools, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And
Wild Style never played any house parties or anything?
we played one house party, you know, one house party. So there were like these high school performances, and then I think a couple of house parties. Yeah, and that was it. That was all.
So was it an ad in Max Rock and Roll? Like, how did you wind up auditioning, or how did this wind up happening? I remember reading somewhere it was an ad in Max Rock and Roll that you responded to, or that you got.
Or was it a flyer?
It was a flyer.
Okay.
It was a flyer that my friends saw on Haight Street, and my friend Dave Cotter, that I was playing in a band with at that time, the band Wild Style, as Chris mentions. We were like basically kind of like a RKL ripoff band because we loved RKL so much. Like I was a huge fan of RKL before I joined them, and so was everybody else at that time. You know, like we thought RKL was the greatest thing in the whole world, and pretty much, you know, it was, to me at least. You know, it was like right when Keep Laughing, or after Keep Laughing came out. And so Dave had seen that flyer and then told me that RKL was looking for a bass player, but I didn't want to audition for the band. And one day he set up an audition for the band without me knowing, and picked me up one day and said, "Hey man, we're gonna go, you know, do something." And I'm like, "Okay, cool." And then on the way to San Francisco, well, actually the audition was in Marin with Bomber and Barry at the time. He had said, "Yeah, you're gonna go audition for RKL." And I was like, "Oh fuck, man, really? Like, why did you put me on the spot like that?" Blah blah blah, you know. But we were so into RKL, like even if I didn't get the gig or whatever, like it would have been rad just to meet like our heroes and just, you know, shoot the shit. But apparently I got the gig, so I wasn't prepared for that either.
Chris, what did you think when it was brought up that there was going to be a 17-year-old potentially now in the band?
I didn't have a second thought about that. I couldn't believe that he could play Bomber's bass lines. You know, I was totally impressed. Like I think I was out of town at that time when Joe came up and auditioned, because they also auditioned Mikey Offender from the Offenders, and he definitely had chops. He could have probably done it, but Joe was more impressive and definitely fit in better with our whole thing, because you know, Bomber's background was having an older sister from in the 70s. Like his, you know, she was like a party chick, I think, and she used to listen to Kiss, and Bomber was super into Kiss and like I don't know, like pretty hard, whatever the hardest rock was back then, you know, like and so the Offenders, I don't know, I think they, for some reason, Joe just fit in better. He was with the skateboarding and stuff, and just he learned Bomber's crazy bass riffs quicker, I think. And yeah, I think Bomber just saw the opportunity to mold this young boy into what he wanted to be.
And I was definitely impressionable for sure, but yeah, I mean, I didn't even know that I was going to be able to play those parts either, because when we went for the audition, we had a Wild Style like rehearsal tape, and I wrote most of those tunes. Me and Dave wrote them, and it did sound like RKL. So like when we showed Bomber and Barry the songs, he's like, it's like, oh, okay, so you guys, you know, like this is the right influence, you know, like I think you could do this. Like you could definitely play the older stuff for sure. And then he gave us a mixed of, I guess it was like maybe a rough mix of Rock and Roll Nightmare, and told me to listen to it and asked me, if you can learn these songs, then give me a call. And then Dave and I on the way home started listening to Rock and Roll Nightmare before it came out, and we were just ecstatic. Like we're getting to listen to a brand new RKL album that's not even out. But dude, it was insane. I was like, oh my God, what the fuck is going on, you know, because it was just like progressive rock, but like, you know, on liquefy, like blender style, just so fast and gnarly. We couldn't believe it. And well, because I was into rock and roll, and I think that's why I was a good fit, is because my roots were in rock, and I think everybody else's in the band's roots and influences were also in rock, and definitely prog rock and stuff like that. Like I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna try to learn this, but there was no way that I could learn the songs by ear. So when I called Bomber back, I had said, okay, I think I can play this stuff, but I can't pick it up on the record. I need you to show me how to play it. Mm-hmm. And because I had been playing for so long, I mean, like I wasn't well refined, you know, but my brother was a you know, like a metal lead guitar player, you know, so he would show me things and I would just pick up on things, and I always played my bass like a guitar, so I think that's how I learned everything so quickly. I just thought it was like a constant bass solo, but I was already doing like fills and solos and stuff like that. So I picked up on it really quick, and yeah, it was fucking radical. I mean, I couldn't believe I could play those things. I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. And then I started learning it, and I'm like, wow, I can play it. I couldn't believe it, actually.
I'm like always interested in this because normally the bass player too, but by bass players that join a band that's already going, that has, you know, a few years in, or sometimes many years in, and how you find where you fit in that band. And not necessarily just bass players, but like Lars was on this show talking about when he was a kid and all of a sudden he's in the UK subs and how he fucked it all up and just had to go home. Charlie Harper sent him home. You know, we're talking to like Robert about when he joined Metallica, and just how like it was one thing to be able to play the parts, it's another thing to be in that situation and be able to kind of like feel out the personalities and to kind of like be part of this chemistry that's already been established over these years. And I guess maybe that's why it works so well at 17. You're just so excited to be there and can play all this shit, so there's no ego to get in the way of you fitting in or something. I don't know. Why do you think it worked out?
Yeah, I mean, I was just happy to be there, right? And I was just like mesmerized by Bomber's ability and everybody's ability in the band. I mean, once we got together and jammed together, I was like, oh my God, this is like the greatest thing in the world. This is like the most talented musicians I've ever played with up until that point. Um, and I think the culture too, because I'd just been a skate punk for so long and was into skateboarding, you know, like I had also surfed with my friends too, and them coming from Santa Barbara and having that same culture. Mm-hmm. It's just like we kind of all just gelled together like immediately, you know?
Yeah. Was it scary at all?
It was. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be scared, and I'm 40 something years old now.
I mean, it was scary because, like, I mean, I don't know these people, right? And I'm 17 years old, and here I am going, like, on a train, you know, on my skateboard in a bus, like going into the upper Haight by the Panhandle. Like, I don't know these dudes. I'm going to some house. I mean, I could get like fucking killed or something, you know?
Yeah.
It was a little scary, and I didn't even tell my parents that I was doing it. I just went and did it. Like every time I'd cut school and go to San Francisco to skateboard, and that was many times. I mean, we'd go to Hunters Point to the Dish and skate the Hunters Point ramp. You know, I never told my parents I did that either, but that was fucking scary too. You know, that was a bad fucking neighborhood.
Yeah.
You know, but it was just like one of those times. I was just, okay, well, I'm gonna give it a shot. And you know, if I'm in trouble, I got a skateboard to hit somebody with, and I got it to fucking get away as quickly as I possibly can.
And there's like a fearlessness that you have when you're younger that I guess leads you to a lot of adventures, but something that when you're an adult or a little bit older, you'd be like, there's no fucking way I'm doing that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, you get street smarts, right, when you get older. So you know what kind of situations to keep yourself out of because you've been there before and you know how sketchy it is, right?
Mm-hmm. It's
Um,
go on, sorry.
oh yeah, yeah. But when you're younger, you're just kind of up for those adventures.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? A lot more because it's just you're resilient. You know, you could. I mean, 17. It seems really young, but it's not that young. You know.
I'm looking at my 14-year-old and I'm like, in 3 more years, would I let him go off with one of the most legendarily wild bands of all time? Like, I guess I know in a way that your parents didn't necessarily know about the reputation of the band. And I guess also that reputation develops while you're in the band too.
Well,
Yeah, I don't think we had much of a reputation yet at that
yeah,
point.
and that's true. And also, my parents had met the whole band. You know, like Balmer would come over and you know he would we would hang out and we would play music and we you know sometimes he would spend the night and he met everybody in the band or my parents met everybody in the band and everybody was cool, you know, everybody was nice. And so they were like, well, you know, they're kids, but they're all pretty solid and they're nice people, you know, they have a good heart and it's true that everybody in the band did, you know.
And I guess there's also this quality to punk rock where there is sort of this Peter Pan, Neverland feel to it. And I mean this in the best ways because it can also go badly as well with this thing. But where, I got into punk rock, I had friends that I traded records with that were in their 50s when I was like 14. We just like, they had records that I wanted. I had a record they wanted. We trade records. There's nothing creepy or weird about it. It was completely normal for us to talk for hours about music. And it now as a scared parent, like if my kid came home and was like, I'm hanging with a bunch of 20-year-old kids or 30-year-old kids, I'd be like, what? No, no way this is happening under my roof.
Right? Isn't that a trip that you can see that now as a parent?
Yeah.
And probably you're more protective because you've been down a seedy road. Maybe I'm not judging, but
I think it's doing this podcast, hearing like your story or Stephen McDonald's story, like all these kids that had these wild adventures super young, that it's made me more of a lock the kids up kind of parent. I'm like, oh my God, the terrors that await you out there.
Well, in the 70s, I mean, we all used to climb in the back of the pickup truck with the dogs and go driving. My dad would be drinking beers in the front. Wow.
Yeah, different times. But I
Yeah.
think Joe touched on it earlier, Chris, with like you said, you guys didn't have much of a reputation at that point, but RKL seems to be a band that immediately kids wanted to make bands that sounded like RKL. Like it's one of those bands, and it happens a lot, definitely afterwards in punk rock, where these certain records come out and just kind of change the ecosystem around them, where kids want to do that sound or it takes the sound in a slightly different direction. And Fat Mike has been screaming that from the rooftops for years and years, but Wild Style too, like Joe's saying, like there is that wave of bands that kind of follow you guys that almost immediately are trying to live up to this legend.
I mean, I don't know, when I look back at the first two US tours that we did, one was with Dr. No, and and we did another one with some band called Beyond Possession. Two completely disastrous tours. They both, I don't think we finished either one of those tours. And most of the gigs that we showed up at, we didn't know that you're supposed to advance the show before you start driving there. I mean, we just show up at this address that somehow I don't even remember how we booked those tours, but they were completely like Johnny's living room, and just it was the worst. And every band we played with was like the worst 2-chord, like hardcore barking dog vocal bands, and they were all like, most of those bands were horrible. And then and for some reason we ended up playing like a show with Subhumans, and once in a while we'd get this gem of a band to play with, and we ran into Scream, and we played a CBGB Sunday matinee with Scream, but then like the other shows across the Midwest and stuff, we were all with just the worst, like the worst thrash bands you could ever imagine, and in the worst situations with the worst PA and the worst everything you could even think of, and no money. And so like at the time it was just like, wow, this is really not working out. And then somehow we got this after Rock and Roll Nightmare came out, and we got Joe, and we started playing around San Francisco a lot. We rarely left the Bay Area for a while, and then we got this offer to go tour Europe, and we did that 2 years in a row. And when we came back to California after that second European tour, we went and played in Reseda, which is like northern LA, and the place sold out in like half an hour. And it was like all of a sudden there's all this, people knew who we were, and it was really crazy because we were like struggling so hard before that.
I think it's on that first Dr. No tour. There's actually a website, Metal Forum, that has every show you guys ever played and flyers for most of them. Theirs. So I was pouring over that today, and I think it's on that first Dr. No tour. You guys play in Seattle, and Malfunction's on the bill. And I think it's so awesome that these two bands are playing together. Obviously, you guys, the impact you have on California punk and Southern California punk in particular, and stuff in the 90s, and then the impact Malfunction kind of has on all those Seattle bands in their wake too. And that's a great thing about punk, is that you can have these bands that would have massive impacts, worldwide impacts, but they're playing together on shows that sometimes were a little undersold.
Yeah. I know for a fact there are some flyers on that website that we never played.
This one, I think, it was not redacted. There's a bunch that are redacted on that site, I noticed.
Yeah. Because people used to just make flyers and just put us on the flyer and hope that we showed up, and we were just like, what? We're playing? Oh.
Hey, did you guys do a tour with the Melvins too? I thought
that's a Beyond Possession tour. The Melvins were the other band on that bill.
So we ran into them, and their tour had fallen apart. There's a huge story with that tour, but they were nobody yet, and they were driving that gold Econoline van that they auctioned off on eBay because Kurt Cobain apparently did some artwork on it, which was actually Bomber's artwork.
It was the Kiss drawing on the side was Bomber.
Okay, so we saw this van. We're already like listening to Kiss in our van. And we had Dr. No and us in one vehicle, no trailer. All the gear was underneath the platform. And this wasn't even an extended van. It was insane. But we see this crazy van, and it actually had Kiss stencil spray painted on the side of the van. And we ran into these guys, and we're like, who are you guys? And we're like, we're the Melvins, our tour fell apart. And we're like, well, I guess you can tag along with us. And so that we just, all of a sudden they were the opening band on our tour. And Bomber drew the Kiss faces on the side underneath that Kiss spray paint thing, which maybe Kurt Cobain did that part. But I know for a fact that van was auctioned off, and they said that the Kiss faces were drawn by Kurt Cobain, and I saw Bomber draw them. So sorry, whoever bought that van.
That's awesome. Jerry A also brought up that mural on the side of their van from Poison Idea when he was on the show, saying that he hated that Kiss record and it bummed him out when he saw the mural on the side of the van. So that is a very storied mural, not just in the auction world, but also here too. So, but that Melvins tour, there's a bunch of shows. I think it's like Toxic Reasons, Melvins, and Cheetah Crow Motherfuckers from Italy on the bill too. What a 4-band bill. That's a dream bill.
The Melvins were really good back then. We were definitely impressed with them. And Dr. No was cool. That was the Kyle Toucher era of Dr. No. But Kyle was a huge Black Flag fan, and they even played I think it was Black Coffee or one of those My War or something like. They were pretty cool, and we would switch off. Like one night RKL would play last, and the other night Dr. No would play, and then the Melvins were opening. It was actually the shows that did happen were pretty fun, whether or not there was any people there.
Like we talked about earlier, not having a lot of money is definitely something that affected bands. And Buzz has said that the RKL side of that tour was funded by a skateboard store heist. Is that true?
Yeah, kind of.
I think the statute of limitations way expired, but
yeah, it was sad actually. I mean, this guy had this cool little skateboard company called Brand X Skateboards, and in Santa Barbara, and one of Jason's friends said, "Oh, it's I know how to get in that place," and stole probably like a few boxes of skate decks, and they had like skulls on them, and they said Brand X, and we sold them. I don't think the whole tour was funded by that, but there's definitely some gas money that was purchased with the sale of those skateboards, and I'm sure we weren't selling them for much, $20 a piece or something like that. We couldn't have had more than 20 or 30 boards because they're heavy, and but I felt bad because that guy who ran that company was super cool to me when I was just a little kid when we went on that tour. I was a little kid, 15, I think.
what was your relationship like with Alchemy? Because I think I've even read you talk about how there was like a lack of promotion from them, and it kind of undercut the band a little bit during that era.
So there was Mark Diertrum. I can't remember how to say his name. Mark, and then what was the other guy's name? The
Victor
main
Hayden.
Guy. Victor, yeah. So I do not know how Bomber met them, but Bomber worked out that whole deal, and I don't think anybody else would have put out a full comic book lyric sheet at that time. I mean, that must have cost a fortune. So I mean, they were cool. I mean, I think it was much easier to buy the record in England than it was in the States because that's where he was based out of. I don't remember having a lot of complaints about them. They probably didn't advertise that much, but the fact that they put out they put out the comic book, and they pretty much did anything we asked as far as production of that album. And I mean, we recorded that record for dirt money. I mean, we went to a little 16-track studio that was a front of my mom's living room, and we did it in like 6 days, I think. So Bomber played drums and bass on that record.
It's such an interesting label too, because Victor Hayden's like Captain Beefheart's cousin, right? And he did like
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Really?
he did art for Zappa, and has like deep, that side of I guess prog, for lack of a better term, but like that whole like Zappa Beefheart verse kind of connections too. But he apparently also was one of the people that started the Gilman, or like helps the Gilman form.
Huh. I didn't know that history.
And put out some of the greatest records of all time. Like that like the 4-record run of your record, Neurosis, Poison Idea, and that Melvins LP. It's like, I can't think of too many other labels that put out that many significant records in that short period of time. Did you guys play the Gilman much? Like 88 and 87, I think you play, right?
Yeah, there's some videos on YouTube of us playing there, tuning up for 20 minutes and then playing like 30 minutes after that. There's a classic part where while we're tuning, our friend gets on the mic and says, "Does anybody have sticks for the drummer? Sticks? Anybody?" Someone's like, "Ask the other band."
What did you kind of make of that stuff as it's happening, Joe? Because I guess you're really close in age to a lot of the kids that will wind up doing those early Gilman bands.
I thought it kind of sucked that we couldn't drink in the club, personally. But that was when RKL played Gilman Street. I'd been there before, so I definitely knew the deal. I knew that you could drink across the street in the parking lot and stuff like that. But yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, now there's a
Um,
brewery across the street.
but I didn't. I thought Gilman was awesome. Because of what they stood for and all the bands and camaraderie they had there. Um, but I wasn't really involved in that whole scene. Like Berkeley was like another world. I would go out there to see metal bands and stuff like that. And I'd go to Gilman Street to see shows there too, or bands that I really loved. But mostly I was like involved in San Francisco because it was so close to San Mateo that I could get on a bus and go see shows there whenever I wanted to. Berkeley was like way too far away for me. I wasn't about to get on a BART and then go, across the bay and then catch a bus out there to Berkeley too.
And it also feels
It seems so stupid nowadays, right? Because it's like really close.
well, I think they extended the BART eventually to go out there too. So I don't think you have to take the bus maybe as much anymore. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've taken transit out to the Gilman, but it's amazing how different those scenes were because they are geographically so close together. But Oakland, San Francisco, and Berkeley had really distinct kind of little scenes, it seems.
Yeah.
Do you remember that venue called the New Method? It might have been like Emeryville or somewhere like right, not that far from Bay Bridge, I guess. But there was some weird little club called the New Method. I remember seeing a few bands there, but we never played there. I just remember.
I never remember. I don't think I'd been to a show there. I always went out to Gilman or Ruthie's in.
Ruthie's.
Those were the two spots in Berkeley for me.
Yeah, New Method. I think Christ on Parade and Neurosis would play there. I think it's come up a few times on the
Sounds
show.
about right.
And there was, I guess, the Farm as well, or is that already gone by this point?
No,
The farm was there till yeah.
It was still around. That I've seen so many bands at the farm because the one of the buses that came from San Mateo would drop you off right there at that park.
Mm-hmm.
So you could take the I believe it was the 5M, and one of the buses would just drop you off right there. So it was radical. I'd seen so many bands there, and that was the place. Actually, that and the Mabuhay Gardens as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then
wasn't that the farm your first show with RKL?
Mm-hmm. It was, yeah. The day on the farm, right? Or day at the farm.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was the very first show.
Who else played that show? Do you remember?
Osgood Slaughter.
Oh, fucking awesome.
Was it MDC?
Maybe.
Verbal abuse?
Oh yeah, probably our attitude adjustment.
Attitude adjustment.
Probably verbal abuse. Gosh. I'm sure we could find the flyer.
I will definitely look that up.
Used to play there all the time. I mean, attitude adjustment, verbal abuse, MDC, DRI. I mean, I saw Bad Braids at the farm.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Youth at the farm. It's so many good bands at the farm.
Well, it's interesting because like we're talking about like LA, it kind of dies off, and I guess it does come back with a vengeance at a certain point, but in San Francisco, it just bubbles the whole way through. And then by the time the 90s roll around, the Bay Area is kind of the epicenter for punk rock and DIY punk rock with like all the labels.
For punk rock and metal.
Oh yeah, metal too, I guess, definitely. Unfortunately, I don't know as much about that genre, so I'm a little lost when I start talking about metal, but I think there's crossover. Like you're talking about Verbal Abuse, though, is a crossover kind of band between the two worlds, and Attitude Adjustment seems to be a band that could have worked in both places as well.
So when the first time RKL went to San Francisco, we couldn't get gigs in LA. Golden Voice was basically running all the shows in LA, and because we were from Santa Barbara, we weren't really a legitimate punk band. They'd throw us a bone here and there, but the shows we would get were pretty crummy, and the billing was usually pretty bad. Like Mother's Day, playing, at 2 o'clock on Mother's Day at the Palladium, with 9 more bands after us or something. And so we just drove up to San Francisco with nothing planned, and we heard about this place where punk bands could stay called the Vats, and it was the Hams beer vats, and MDC and DRI rehearsed there. And that first night we got up there, we went to the MDC rehearsal space. I think that's where we might have met Barry, and we had a gig at the Mabuhay Gardens that night, and I think it was with DRI, and I mean, we were just like, wow, this is so much cooler than LA. And then Bomber said, I'm moving to San Francisco, and we all ended up moving up there except for Jason Sears. Never left Santa Barbara. He just loved it down there.
It is like it seems like a much more kind of fun vibe for bands too. Like it seems like like the bands you mentioned are obviously, I guess, all Texas that kind of move up there, but there is that kind of free, I don't want to say hippie because it's not, but like sort of that like free spirit vibe to San Francisco.
It was more friendly, that's for sure.
Yeah, people don't get knifed at Dickies shows there.
Yeah.
But there was that foul record scene, and then people talk about like the fuck ups, and there were like some Sick Pleasure. There were some like tougher bands as well, I guess, up there.
Bang.
Yep. Another one. Flipper too. You hear some stories about Flipper being pretty intense, and it seems like it's slightly more adult too, the San Francisco stuff, like, or older.
Yeah, more mature probably, and more experimental. I mean, Dead Kennedys were kind of setting the pace for that as well, and they were so original, and mixing surf music with punk rock, and they weren't just thrash, another thrash band.
So what was your first tour, Joe? Like, was it Europe?
It was, yeah. It was Europe with RKL, and that was in 87.
88.
Was it in 88?
Yeah, we went there 88, 89.
Oh yeah, 88, 89. Okay. I think I was thinking 87 because I was 17, but yeah, so 88, and that was my first tour ever. I had no idea of what it was going to be about and how it was going to go about. I didn't even have any questions. I was just like along for the ride. And I think everybody was kind of doing the same thing too. We put a lot of faith into Dave Pollock and Destiny, because he, Dave MDC had hooked us up with Dave Pollock and said, yeah, this guy will, take care of you and give you a place to stay. And then also he had friends in Amsterdam who we stayed with too as well. And then he just booked us a tour, and most of the shows were at like squats, like punk rock occupied squats. And it was a trip. Like we'd show up for a gig, and we were like, where in the hell are we? It was just like, so it would look like some bombed building, really, and you walk in, and there's all these like community punks like just walking around, and everybody has jobs, and everybody's doing something, and they're cooking us like dinner, and then they just make these weird venues in these old decrepit buildings.
Yeah, we would just look for the crumbling brick building with the circle and the arrow through it, and that was where we were playing.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And then you'd walk into the music hall, or whatever you want to call it, the music room, and it'd be just like in the basement, with like water leaking, and and like, you know, I don't know, stereo speakers for like PA or something like that, and like one microphone.
Yeah.
You know, and it was insane. And a lot of these places were just, they would get the gear, I guess, wherever they could get it, and they would just put these shows. And I mean, a lot of them what just went off, because like, even if everybody from the squat like showed up to the show, there'd already be like, you know, 50 to 100 people. So you know, these shows were like really fun. And then you know, we got to play in front of a lot of people, and then I think the word just got out. I mean, you know, we were playing well, we were on top of it. We had our own gear, we shipped our own gear there. So no matter how loud the vocals were over the music was just fucking intense. So the word just got out, and more and more people started showing up to our shows.
And at the end of the tour, we recorded that live record.
Yeah.
It
It was, we were getting out of the squats. It was weird. I almost want to think that Dave was just booking the whole tour on the fly, because suddenly, like, after like, I don't know, like 3 weeks of touring, we're actually playing like real venues. And I'm like, how did this happen? You know, and so he must have gotten offers, you know, for us. And then we're starting to like play these real venues, and then all these kids start showing up, and we're not playing like these dirty squats anymore. Or the squats that we do play, they're more organized with like professional music venues like Van Hall and Amsterdam and stuff, like big places that have their shit together. And it was insane, but we were just basically along for the ride, you know, like we just get in a van, and with all our gear, and another band. Who opened up for us? Was No Pigs?
No Allegiance, maybe?
No Pigs was a part of it. They're from Amsterdam. And then we had Archie's band. We had Dave Pollock's band, No Allegiance.
Yeah.
And then the next tour was Dave's other band, Happy Hour.
Yeah, Happy Hour. Yep.
But there's a funny story about No Allegiance. No Allegiance was trying to book a U.S. tour or to play in New York, and this guy Johnny Stiff from New York was a promoter or a booking agent in New York, and Dave said he couldn't pronounce No Allegiance, so he called them Norwegians. And so he said, "Yeah, I got this band, Norwegians from Germany." And they say, "Norwegians from Germany? What do you mean? Would they be Germans from Germany?" "No, not Norwegians, Norwegians."
Yeah. I had no idea he went on tour with No Pigs. That band's fucking amazing. What a tour. Oh, that 12-inch is killer. There's and that European squat venue system, I assume it's still like this today. It certainly was like that when I started going over and touring Europe. Like that is like, it just is such an established system that now I think bands take it for granted. But I imagine going over there for the first time and seeing that, it must have been shocking. Like where you're getting fed meals. Like granted, the venues are dodgy and the sleep places are a little suspect, but
yeah,
at least you're getting food.
Yeah,
I mean, yeah. I mean, most of the time it was a good time, because like it would be sketchy. I mean, you would probably think that there's bugs in the beds and stuff like that. But
that was a quote in Bologna. I think they said, "Oh, we have this room. We have this room, but you can't sleep there. They have how you say bugs."
Yeah, but it was great. I mean, it was a party, because you'd have a great show, and then you just go upstairs and just rage with everybody from the squad. They were just so happy to have the band there, you know, any band there. It was awesome. That's pretty much how we survived. I think it was like the little money we got went to gas, and then all the beer and food we ate was all supplied by the squats, pretty much.
Yeah, it feels like there's a few bands that didn't live over there. Like you're saying, you guys only did 2 tours, but it like would go over there and in a pre Nirvana, pre Green Day, pre Offspring kind of world, like it was a lot more pleasant than touring North America, it would seem back then.
Definitely.
For
It was
sure.
still sketchy, but it was nicer for sure. I mean, there's no way that those squats would have existed in the United States. I mean, they would have been destroyed immediately by the kids staying there for one thing. And but the organization was there. I mean, it was pretty amazing. We were definitely impressed by the whole situation. And everywhere we went, these places were pretty amazing. And the fact that the law allowed these kids to take over these abandoned buildings and do stuff and have live music and serve alcohol and food. I mean, that would never happen here.
No, you'd end up playing a bunch of crack houses
Yeah.
in the United States.
Yeah. That's the North American equivalent, I guess, is the.
It is, yeah. Well, back in the 80s, that would be the American equivalent is crack houses as opposed to, legal SWATs.
I mean, when I was a young kid, I went down with some older friends. One of them, Vince from RKL, one of the first bass players we had. We went to an LA show and we had nowhere to stay. I don't remember even how we got down there, but we ended up staying at this abandoned hotel in Hollywood called, it might have been downtown LA actually. They called it Motel Hell. And it was just like 12-story abandoned hotel. And it was sketchy. The people that told us about it said, yeah, just get in there, find an empty room and barricade your door. And they said, don't go down into the lower levels, like below the street level, because it's extremely dangerous. And it was so sketchy.
Yeah. Or even the vats, like you're saying, it was pleasant, but like you hear people talking about how they thought it was very scary when they were kids growing up there. Like, oh, don't go down to those vats place. It's terrifying. And
the scariest thing was that our guitar player, Al, pooped in the stairwell and he might have slipped on it if you weren't. It was so dark.
It's like, we are the scary people, mister. There's nothing for us to be scared of. We're pooping in the halls. You guys break up in 89. And I think, I don't know who said in the band, but someone was saying it was like the worst decision to break up at that time. And
I still say that, yeah.
And I would say that too, because we were coming off our second European tour. The Live in Berlin record is going off. Like, it's the first time in the history of the band where we're like, well, especially in Europe, like selling out or playing in front of like 500 to like 1,000 people, you know? I mean, it was insane. Like, to have that type of success in a short amount of time, I believe well, I mean, the band had been around for a long time, but like for really working and touring, about 2 years now, we're playing like all these bigger venues and like pro places, like real music venues. And then, like Chris said, at the Reseda Country Club, we sell that place out. I think the cap is like 1,000 people. I mean, the Chili Peppers sold it out the night before we played there. And here we are, RKL, and we're selling out the same place Red Hot Chili Peppers did. And then after that gig, we decide to quit. Like, that doesn't make any fucking sense.
Yeah.
We're just writing new music too, like we put a new song out on Live in Berlin, Rumors, and Bomber's writing new song, and we're writing new music, and the music's just as good as it was on Rock and Roll Nightmare. And the future looks bright, and then we decide to quit.
Was that the direction it was going to go in, Rumors, versus the stuff that came out? Obviously, Reactivate's a different band with just the name on it, but like, was it going to be like Reactivate, do you think, or would it have been more like the Rumors song?
If Bomber had continued to play drums and help, he wrote a lot of that crazy stuff on Rock and Roll Nightmare. Yeah, I probably would have continued in that direction. But Bomber was clearly sick of playing drums and buying cymbals and sticks and drum heads and carrying around drums, and he wanted to be the front man. He was like, why should this Jason guy get to be up there in front, singing my songs the way that, not the way that I hear it in my head. So he felt like he had to show the world how he really wanted these songs to sound, because he would wake up in the morning with the song written in his head, all the parts, all the vocal harmonies, and it was like, I'm sure much different than the way we played them. It was more like Queen in his head, like fully orchestrated and graphically, what do you say? Graphically designed and whatever. He had all these concepts.
I have this whole album conceptualized and graphic designed, and yeah.
He had always said that Jason was holding us back, and that he thought we could be like Aerosmith or Chili Peppers or Living Colour, and that's kind of the direction he was trying to pull us into. This, he wanted to be the next Queen, basically, or kind of apparently Living Colour was kind of the soulful, funky rock music,
which was going off at the time. Really, a lot of bands like that were coming out.
Rich Kids on LSD is a very high concept band, so it makes sense that these things were kind of conceptualized in his head, because like graphically, right out of the gate, there's a visual identity for this band. And like you're saying, with the comic book coming with the record, like these things felt more than just a collection of songs, which is like a lot of hardcore bands' albums when they wind up doing full LPs. It felt like this was like an actual record, like a real band would make, quote unquote real band.
Yeah, once again, I think it was like Bomber's vision. Rock and Roll Nightmare, he basically wrote a lot of that album too, and songs like Break the Camel's Back, like Chris was saying, like going in, we laugh at what they call the house PA, Battered and Frayed, we won't get paid today, or Battered and Frayed, we won't sound good today, and later on we find we don't get paid. You know what I mean? That's like stuff that they lived through, and he did conceptualize that whole thing.
And the comic book idea, and along with Danny's artwork, the whole thing was pretty amazing how it all came together, considering how scattered we all were.
And it's pretty epic because, I know that there were other bands who had tried to do the same thing, but no punk band, as far as I know, had done any kind of production like that before.
Yeah, like the only thing I could think of that's kind of comparable to like the visual identity and sort of the vibe of the band is something like the Misfits, where they kind of like had this whole sort of conceived vision. And this is like not at all like the Misfits, almost like, but like very much in the same sort of way that without even seeing the band live, you knew the vibe from just listening to records and flipping through the liner notes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Except for the kids that thought we were a straight edge band.
Yeah.
Were there kids that thought you guys were straight edge?
On the first US tour that we showed up, and all these kids had X's on their hands because we had that song Why and Pothead. So they're like, and Life in a Bottle. There was a lot of kind of anti-drug songs in our catalog, but we were talking about ourselves.
Hey Chris, do you remember that show in Europe that we showed up for the gig, and it was like all straight edge kids, and it was a straight edge venue?
No, but I remember it in the States. Yeah.
It was there was a show in Europe where we showed up, and it was a total straight edge show.
Yeah.
We show up and we're smoking pot and drinking, and the kids are freaking out. And they totally thought that RKL was a straight edge band, and they were giving us tons of shit. And I remember that we didn't even play that show. We just fucking bailed.
Probably smart.
It would have
Yeah.
killed the buzz.
Yeah, it was a buzzkill.
And I will say,
Like, we wanted to keep the party going, man, and those guys were sticks in the mud.
and I like pothead when I was straight edge, but now that I smoke weed, pothead hits so differently. It's a
Yeah, so does heroin.
yeah, I imagine that would be a very. I'm glad I just stuck to the pothead. I don't have to get into some other vibes, but drugs are certainly a part of the band's external story. People put that on the band, and it seems like drugs were an issue in the band. I was wondering if that was something the whole time, or is that something that kind of started later on?
Pretty early on. Um, some of our friends started using needles way before we even moved to San Francisco. So Bomber had hepatitis from shooting drugs, and that's when he wrote Rock and Roll Nightmare, because he was stuck at home with hepatitis. He left our tour. I think it was the '95 disaster tour. He left from New York because he had hepatitis, and we had to drive all the way from New York to California with no shows. And that's when Bomber wrote Rock and Roll Nightmare. He was just stuck at home, and he wrote that whole record.
I remember when I went to go audition for RKL, that Bomber had mentioned that he had gotten over hepatitis.
That was right after him.
Yeah, that was like right after, and I didn't even know what hepatitis was. I was afraid that I was going to catch some disease or something. It's like, is that contagious?
How much awareness, Joe, did you have about drugs and drug culture prior to being in the band? Like, you're a kid, but you're also growing up.
Well, my extent of drug use up until that point was pretty much just weed. I smoked a lot of weed, drank too, and had taken psychedelics. But I wasn't well versed in. No one was doing heroin in high school or anything like that. No one was really doing speed. Well, I had a few friends who did speed, but I never had done speed or cocaine or nose drugs. But as far as like tripping, doing hallucinogenics, I had done that before. So that was the extent of my drug use up until that point.
It's sort of the tragic story of punk rock the whole way through is needle drugs, but in particular heroin. And it always shows up for some reason in punk. And I guess it's people dealing with trauma, self-medicating, but right from the get-go in every scene to this day, like I lost friends in the last few years because of opioids. And it's this weird specter that hangs over this scene at every stage.
It's not just punk either. I mean, it's all of rock music and new wave as well.
I mean, really, if you think about it, it's just music is just kind of collateral damage. I think that it's just overall, it's just an epidemic. You know what I mean? Especially with the influx of fentanyl too. It's just not music. I think musicians are like kind of like the suffering type of souls or whatever, and doing drugs kind of puts you into a mental headspace that I think if you're creative, it might make you think that you're writing better stuff. But I mean, there's a lot of musicians that are actually insanely talented who have done heroin. And I don't know if it's the heroin or the musician, but there is some kind of correlation. It doesn't make me want to do heroin. But it doesn't make me want to do heroin, but I mean, I could see how that like kind of helps the person along in that journey.
I think though, because punk is so honest and open, well, at times with itself, but like going back to like proto punk stuff, like the Velvet Underground with Heroin, and it's not necessarily that punk glamorizes it because there are all these cautionary tales with it, but it's just part of the story. Like how many kids are like, well, I guess this is my Johnny Thunders phase right now that I'm entering, so I might as well start doing heroin at this point, just because it is weirdly ingrained in the culture. Like when Prince died, I was like shocked. I'm like, wow, Prince had a struggle with opioids. I had no idea.
Mm.
But that's not really the case with punk rock. I think people are a lot more open with their struggles with these things. So, because it's in the art, it's talked about in the song lyrics, or it's talked about in the interviews. It's just a lot more on the surface, I think, in punk than other places in music that I see it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think if you're a big, huge rock star, you probably don't want people knowing that you're high on heroin, right?
I think the Stones had a couple songs about it, and I mean they're like the biggest rock stars in the world.
Yeah. And they're also weirdly, I guess, because you look at American garage rock, kind of the proto punk to the proto punk in a lot of ways with the Rolling Stones. So maybe we got to blame them.
With no Rolling Stones, there'd be no New York Dolls or the Heartbreakers.
Totally.
Yeah. Like the greatest American rock and roll band of all time, the Rolling Stones. This has been phenomenal, and I've punished you guys extensively, and I haven't even talked to you guys about any bands post the dawn of the 90s. So if you guys ever want to come back and do other episodes of the stuff you did after the year 1990, you are always welcome on this podcast, because there's a lot more that I'd love to talk to you about.
Great, thank you.
For sure. I would love to be back,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really even think that we scratched the surface on anything that RKL has really done. I mean, we've talked about a lot, obviously, but I mean, there's just so much more to this story. It's insane. You can't get it in an hour or 2 hours, or maybe even 3 hours,
Yeah, there's a lot of a friend was writing me tonight, and he's like, what are you doing tonight? I'm like, I'm interviewing RKL, and just kind of like, we're just kind of going over all the interesting things about this band. That there's this band that is hugely influential, outlives kind of that LA hardcore boom and transcends it and becomes part of this other scene. There's also just the heaviness that also exists around the band. And then there's also this weird chapter that I have to ask you about, Josh Brolin going out all over the place saying that he's one of the founding members of the band. And when Joey Cape was on the show, I told that to Joey, and Joey was shocked because he's like, I had no idea Josh Brolin was in RKL. I thought I was one of the founding members of RKL. So who are the founding members, Chris, other than yourself?
It was me, Jason, and Balmer. Josh was good friends with Jason, and they lived not far from each other. I think Jason used to come over to Josh's house, and Josh had probably a drum kit and a bass guitar or something. And the last story I heard from Josh about it was they called themselves Cito Vice Squad or something, and they were like going to be a punk band. It was just two of them. That was it. And then I only remember Josh coming to our RKL pad one time, and so no, he was never in the band, but he has clarified that fact now.
And what about Joey Cape?
Joey was at one of the very first rehearsals playing rhythm guitar, and I think he thought his story is that he got kicked out because he would never showed up to practice, but we all assumed that he thought we sucked because he was into metal. He was all into metal with his friends, and his friends all collected British metal and stuff, and we were just trying to play like Wasted Youth and covers, and we were horrible when we first started, but so we just figured he thought we sucked. At least that's what I figured, because he never showed up to practice after that, and so we just continued with one guitar for a while, and then eventually there's a couple times where we had two guitars and then back to one, but Yeah, Joey was the rhythm guitar player. As far as I remember, one practice, probably our first practice.
Well, anytime you want to come on here, break down the family tree. Joe, anytime you want to come here and talk about how they traumatized you as a youth, this is a safe space to share that stuff. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, man.
It's punk rock bowling time. That's right, for the 24th year, one of the greatest festivals on earth, in my opinion, returns to downtown Las Vegas the weekend of May 25th, 26th, and 27th. I have had some of my greatest times playing this thing and just hanging out at this thing. You want to know how much this festival speaks to Turn Out a Punk's mindset? The headliners are Devo, Descendants, and Madness. Every day of this festival, the lineup is stacked with amazing bands of all types and stripes of punk and hardcore from all different eras, from ska to post-hardcore. We're talking like Bratmobile to Rock from the Crypt to Stiff Little Fingers to the Cosmic Psychos to Scowl to Chad. And then there's also all these late night after shows which are happening. And you wouldn't believe the lineup of these things, from the Zeros to Agnostic Front and everything in between. This festival is out of control for fans of punk. So I hope I will see you there, because this isn't like some sort of festival that you just go to and the bands are secluded in some sort of backstage area. Bands and fans and just punks alike are all just taking over downtown Las Vegas. So you turn around and all of a sudden you're gambling beside John Doe from X. I don't know if John Doe gambles, but if you turn around on the buffet line, you'll probably see me. And you better believe we're going to be talking about punk music. And because this festival loves this podcast as much as this podcast loves this festival, Punk Rock Bowling is bringing you a series of special episodes. So each and every week, I will have an episode going up featuring someone that's playing this festival. And hot damn, are there some good ones coming. Head over to punkrockbowling.com and hopefully I see you in downtown Las Vegas, May 25th, 26th, and